The race is on, and Ferrari heads to Monza after a disastrous weekend at Zandvoort in a season that just isn't getting any better. So has time run out for a turnaround? And with Isack Hadjar grabbing headlines with his podium finish, is promotion to Red Bull Racing inevitable, or more importantly, desirable? I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit those topics and more are Ben Anderson and Glenn Freeman. Glenn, we're going to Monza. Once again, we're talking about Ferrari being disappointing.
Yeah, it's quite good of them to keep finding new ways to make this disappointing season newsworthy. I do have one question though. Do we know for certain that Charles Leclerc has got himself off the sand dune and will be at Monza, or is he stuck in the middle of Zandvoort forever?
Well, we can find out by messaging that photographer's mobile phone that he was that he borrowed for his seat on the dunes. So who knows? Yeah, maybe he's going to do some more of that at Monza. Who knows? But Ben, it's been the same old story, not just over the years, but all of this season, hasn't it? We've been waiting for improvements, and although there have been improvements in relative terms, the story is still the same, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. Relatively, they are better. Formula One's always a relative game. I mean, Zandvoort, they were 2.5 tenths closer to pole than they were last year. But the problem is, McLaren have just moved the bar on absolutely massively. And I feel like both of those teams tried to do similar things, like go for the title in the last year of the rules. McLaren did it right, moved everything along, and Ferrari went, yeah, we're going to change our concept and do the same, and it just hasn't worked. They've kind of got the same old problems. Can't develop the car properly, box themselves into a corner, and now they're just basically stuck.
Yeah, it's difficult for them because in many ways, Glenn, they're not doing terribly compared to, say, Mercedes and Red Bull. It's just that Mercedes and Red Bull have at least managed to get some wins on the board between them, whereas Ferrari's the one that's just not winning, combined with the really, really high expectations. It just means it's that persistent disappointment, isn't it?
I think it's one of those things when you have a dominant team, the number of scraps available for everyone else become reduced. I think if this was more like the bulk of 2024 was, the opportunities, it kind of got shared around, didn't it? That's what happened over the second half of 2024. But we go into every weekend now expecting a McLaren 1-2, and it does take almost freak occurrences to open the door for someone else. So there's not that many opportunities. So I don't really hold it against them that they haven't had the kind of magic Max Verstappen moment for Red Bull, or the kind of freak circumstances that gives Mercedes what they want. But I have a question for you, actually, Ed. We're talking about this season is so disappointing. Everything they try, nothing can fix the problems. Is this all still rooted in the fact that they just can't run the car low enough to the ground, which we know is essential in these rules, which therefore means everything they try is limited by the fact that they're constantly terrified of wearing the plank away under the car and getting excluded?
Yeah, they have had problems there. It wasn't such a problem at Zandvoort, at least not once they'd improved the car from Friday, because on Friday they were struggling on pace, and that was partly because they had to run a bit high, because there's a few places where you get a lot of compression. You could see that actually with a lot of cars on the TV footage. You'd see the smoke and that kind of thing as it ground away on the ground. So yeah, there is part of the battle. They have improved that, but I think the problem is when you're troubleshooting, as they have been, and done the suspension changes and that kind of thing, you're not overall improving the car. So they're almost trying to get the car back to where it should have been at the start of the season, while McLaren's just improving endlessly. And I guess that's important, isn't it, Ben? Because McLaren is very, very good. I know that's stating the obvious, but it was unrealistic to expect Ferrari rather, to change the car and suddenly be beating McLaren, because that's not going to change anything about the tyre management characteristics, which is a great strength for McLaren, particularly on race day. So I guess a small improvement is kind of about what was possible, but there's still this sense that it's just not going well. Obviously, the double DNF in Zandvoort made a big difference, because if they'd finished, Leclerc could have finished third, maybe he could have got Hadjar. Hadjar was being pretty obstinate in that position, but Hamilton was up there with Leclerc as well. So it would have looked a little bit less bad if they didn't have both cars ending up in pieces at turn 3.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, positionally, they are better off. You know, they were third in the Constructors' Championship at this stage last season, and they're second now. So you can spin it whichever way you want, but nevertheless, the gap to McLaren is huge. Yeah, Zandvoort isn't a good look when they both crash, but the fact that Hadjar's in the way, that's problematic too, because it feels like not only have McLaren sort of holistically done the best job in terms of moving the game on, suspension, all the internals. A lot of it is heat rejection, it seems, whether it's the internal components or the tyres or the rims or the brakes. Ferrari are doing lifting and coasting, sometimes for plank reasons, we think, sometimes for conventional fuel and heat reasons. But Racing Bulls have obviously made a big step too. So they've found something that's lifted them into a position where they can be at the front of the midfield if they do everything right, but also pick off teams like Mercedes and Ferrari. And that's not really acceptable if you're Ferrari. If you've gone, right, we're completely changing our development potential of our car over the winter to try and carry the fight to McLaren, who we were very close to beating the season before, you can't then take such a huge step back that or freeze your position so much that a midfield team can start to scalp you. That suggests that whatever they did over the winter in terms of conceiving the car, redesigning their suspension, setting their development path was just the wrong thing. And then they haven't been able to find a way out of it in the way that they managed to last season. This was the point where I felt like 2024 turned around for Ferrari and they fixed their car, and then they were able to challenge for wins reasonably regularly in the last part of the season. This year, it feels like a totally different story. It feels like, at best, if Leclerc has one of his magic weekends, he can finish third. Otherwise, he's just scrapping for minor points.
It's amazing to think that they nearly snuck in and won the Constructors' Championship last season. And we did those live podcasts, or you guys did those live podcasts at the start of the year where we had a vote in the audience where people could send in who do you think is going to win the championship. And at the live show that I was at, where I was hiding backstage, everybody picked Charles Leclerc. Like, in the eyes of a lot of fans, this was going to be his and Ferrari's year. And I think that strong end to 24 is why the way 25 has gone, plus the Lewis Hamilton factor. You've just got a brighter spotlight on you when you make a star driver signing. I think those are the reasons that, as you've outlined, they're doing okay. Like, they haven't fallen off the back of that kind of lead group of teams, but expectations just skyrocketed. And it's one of the things I actually like about the regulations. Like, these regulations we have at the moment aren't perfect, but I do like the fact that you can look like you're on the perfect trajectory. You can be Red Bull a couple of years ago. You can be Ferrari at the end of last year. It's so easy to fall out the window and to get it wrong. And for someone else, even a midfield team, as you mentioned, Ben, to suddenly sort of swoop in and be doing a better job than you, just have a car they can do more with. And I do wonder, if we didn't have the new regs coming in for 26, if we were able to extend these regs, would you get to a point where McLaren tripped themselves up? Because in 2023 and the first part of 24, we'd have never said, oh, Red Bull will completely lose their way in these regulations. At that point, we were probably thinking, I can't wait for 26 to change things. And it feels like that with McLaren now. And Ferrari was so good at the end of last year, but they have tripped themselves up. So it does make you wonder, like, McLaren aren't going to get it wrong in the final however many races we have this year, but you do wonder if the regs went on for longer, would there be another opportunity for a shake-up?
And it's a really good point you make about extending the regs, because normally under this kind of period of stabilisation, you'd expect convergence, and there has been. The field spread's incredibly tight. The midfield is ridiculous, and the number of tenths that can spread from the back end of the top 6 to 20th is tiny. It can be 1 or 2 tenths in a qualifying session.
In the post-race podcast, I don't know if it was you or someone else, you said there's no Q1 cars now. It's like everyone's a Q2 car, but some people fall at the start of qualifying.
Yeah, it's all about execution. But McLaren have extended the gap. You'd normally expect that the team at the front would have a tougher time.
They'd be the ones that hit a ceiling.
Yeah, but they're moving the game on in a way that nobody seems to be able to figure out. And some teams, particularly Red Bull, are so perplexed by that they're just throwing bombs at the FIA continuously at the start of the season to say, what is it about this car? I can understand the mindset when you race, when a car that in normal theoretical circumstances shouldn't be miles ahead of you suddenly makes a huge leap that no one can get near. You just think that car's got to be illegal.
And it should be noted, McLaren have done a blinding job.
Yeah, incredible.
This year, absolutely staggering. And that brings its own benefits, because the hope was, for those who want close competition at the front, that the gap to McLaren would close. But it didn't. But then again, why would it close? Because you've got a Red Bull that dynamically isn't working well. So they need to kind of go back a bit and sort of slightly change direction.
Get Newey back.
Well, exactly, yeah. Mercedes have got their problems. They've been working through Ferrari as well. And all the time, McLaren are just sort of okay. And they've got little things, a bit of trickiness to drive. But they're working on projects like that little suspension tweak for the feel for Norris, really fine detail stuff, because just globally everything is working. So we have to remember that as well. But It's an interesting point as well you made, Glenn, about Lewis Hamilton being there, because that's just added just ever more attention, hasn't it? And stress and pressure.
And expectation.
Exactly. And even at Zandvoort, where actually it was looking pretty good for Hamilton because he seemed quite content, half a tenth off Leclerc in qualifying. He was there in the race. And then, of course, he gets to turn 3 and off he goes in the process, compromising Leclerc's strategy as well. So that just adds on ever more intense pressure, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think obviously the whole reason, I think, other than the Zandvoort disaster, the reason we're talking about Ferrari, this is a good time to take stock of Ferrari, is because we're coming to Monza, where even when they're having a low profile rubbish season, the expectation goes through the roof just for a week. And this time, there would have been huge expectation at the start of the year. If you're Ferrari fans and you're going to go to Monza, you're thinking, this is brilliant. We already love Charles Leclerc. We've seen him win at Monza. He's brilliant. Now we've got Lewis Hamilton. We've got one of the greats coming in as well. I can't wait to go to Monza. This is going to be incredible. And if you're an Italian fan, you've got your Monza ticket, or Ferrari fan, there's Ferrari fans all over the world that will make the trip to Monza. They'll be going there now going, oh God, this is going to be awful. But we have seen Ferrari have bad years before and then bring a Monza special. So should we rule that out?
That was Villeneuve's joke, wasn't it? On the Jacques Villeneuve's joke on the Sky F1 show that, they're not bothered about Zandvoort. They'll be miles off the pace at Zandvoort because they're just focusing on Monza. It's all about Monza.
I didn't have money on it being you that mentioned Jacques Villeneuve rather than Glenn, but I mean, that is a good point. They do tend to bring things to Monza. They say it's not deliberate, but it often has been.
It's very convenient.
Yeah.
I guess the positives for the Tifosi are it is an outlier circuit. Ferrari did win there last year. Obviously, different car.
Yeah.
They could have put some effort into the low downforce trim package, obviously ultra low downforce at Monza. Everyone else is kind of limping on with their array of wings and that kind of thing. Because
Are they though? Because McLaren have been quite strong there, haven't they? Now that the flexi wing resets happened, front and rear, over the start of this year, McLaren, they seem to have got on top of the family of wings, which was a problem for them, particularly when you needed a compromise, like at, say, Spa. So I feel like that, even if Ferrari brings a special, McLaren's probably got enough in the existing arsenal that it can counter that. And it just feels like the raw pace gap between the Ferrari and the McLaren is significant, not so much in qualifying necessarily, but it just in terms of how they can manage the race. I don't feel like Norris and Piastri run into the same kind of tyre management trouble that allows Ferrari to scout them as they did last year. Yes, the Ferrari should be maybe more competitive because of the layout of the circuit and the slow, short corners, and that being basically it. It narrows the setup window anyway, doesn't it, when you don't have to kind of compromise between all these different long duration corner types. But I just don't think that Ferrari's got enough this year. We used to call it the king of the outliers, and they won Monaco last year with Leclerc, but he couldn't win this year. That was his best chance, I felt. And given that, I feel like Monza, he's probably in a good position to get a podium if they execute well, but I don't see a win this year.
See, I was getting stick on our Zandvoort review podcast from John Noble about my lack of optimism about Ferrari. I tried to inject some into this, but I agree with you. I'd be surprised. You can never count anything out in Formula One. McLaren could drop the ball, but it's going to be a hard weekend for them. And realistically,
they've got to drive into each other, haven't they? We have to have Piastri and Norris at the second chicane, I think it was, actually clatter this time, and then there's an opportunity for somebody to steal in. But ordinarily, I don't see it happening. Yeah,
that's the thing that Ferrari needs to do as much as possible this year. Be the team that's there, ready to pick up the pieces if there are pieces to be picked up. Because even just fluking a win will make a big difference, because the championship was gone months and months and months ago. So even just picking up a win could change absolutely everything. If they could do it at Monza against expectations, then that would be doubly good. Let's talk about Isack Hadjar now, the toast of Amsterdam after that podium. Loads of questions actually from the Race Members Club on him, and I'm going to list some names here because we had so many. Andrew Sillett, Johnny O, Andrew Heyer, Ronan Lemieux, Andrea Cockrell, all asking versions of if that result increases his chances of promotion, and if so, actually would he be better off not being promoted in 2026? What do you think, Glenn?
Yeah, I feel sorry for him because he is going to get promoted. He's going to have to drive the doomed second Red Bull. Obviously, this could all change next year under new rules. I think Red Bull would have to go some to have such a particular car from the off under new rules. But if Max Verstappen's going to be there for if he is going to stay long term, like if they make a good enough start in 26 and they do almost accidentally build a car around him again, even though Max says, his feedback was don't do this with the car because we'll end up where we are now. You've got a lot of evidence now that you don't want to be in that second car, and it's not just because the guy in the lead car is so good. But I don't feel that these guys are just purely being outdriven by Max. There's something about the way Red Bull has prepared and designed that car over a long time now that it's just they can't get it to work for anybody else. And I feel really sorry for Hadjar that his reward for doing such a good job, and I think probably overachieving versus expectations for most people this year, his reward is going to be a potentially doomed seat. And I actually think what we need to do is campaign for Red Bull to run one car, and Hadjar can be in the garage on the other side, but can he have a Racing Bulls? And while we're at it, we'll put Tsunoda in a Racing Bulls. Actually, over the last part of this season, let's bring back Sergio Perez as well and give him a Racing Bulls car. We'll run loads of Racing Bulls cars for all the guys who've had problems in the second Red Bull, and they can all run in the middle of the points and be miles ahead of anyone who had to drive a second Red Bull.
Actually, a Red Bull reject one make series in Racing Bulls cars would be great, because you get a grid of 26 and you'd be able to be selective as well, because they've had so many drivers in that programme. So there's an idea. Who'd have thought you'd have come up with that? But the problem is, Ben, Hadjar's clearly done a really, really good job.
Yeah.
He needs more time, but they keep having to promote drivers out of necessity. Gasly was promoted early because they lost a driver. Albon was promoted early because they decided Gasly wasn't the way to go. They brought in Perez as the kind of experienced hand who worked sometimes, didn't work in others. And then the Lawson short-lived experiments. So people are either being promoted from Racing Bulls just because it's all they've got, or because somebody's gone and they've got to go in early. Because ideally you'd want Hadjar to have, let's say, 3 years is a good number of years, you would probably say.
Yeah, maybe. If you're spoilt for choice, or you've got an embarrassment of riches, but it's all connected, isn't it? They don't have the pick of young drivers coming up through karting that they used to have, because they've got more competition in that space from all the teams they're racing with in Formula One now. They've also got the problem of Max. He did one season at Toro Rosso and a handful of races at the start of 2016, 23, I think, in the end, which is a season now, pretty much, isn't it? And then he was dropped into the main Red Bull team and was pretty much on Ricciardo's pace straight away, and was so impressive in that first. I know he won on his debut, but that was a bit circumstantial. It's the qualifying performance. It was like until the last knockings of Q3, Verstappen was quicker than Ricciardo, and they were like, okay, this kid is every bit as mega as we thought he was, because he's proved it against the incumbent guy who'd booted out 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel. At some point, if you're going to prove yourself at the top of Formula One, you have to take on the big dogs. And Hadjar, even if it's kind of fun to say, well, yeah, it's unfortunate that it's the promotion you don't want because of what's happened before, you can't have the mindset of, well, this driver, it didn't work for him, this driver, it didn't work for him, this driver, it didn't work for him. I'm different. I'm going to be the one that goes in and shows, actually, Max Verstappen isn't all that, or I can take the fight to him. Probably people would have said before George Russell went to Mercedes, no, he's not going to. It's going to take him a long time to get up to Lewis Hamilton's level, but 3 years down the line, he was basically quicker than Lewis. Certainly quick enough that Mercedes didn't really need Lewis anymore. So Russell's done his work, and then you generate the self-confidence. The team starts to listen to your feedback more because you've proven you can do it. And we probably see the phenomenon that's happened to the second Red Bull driver, an extreme version because it's been so much rotation. That is a problem. You need some stability. In other places, is the reason that Kimi Antonelli's struggling a bit alongside Russell in the Mercedes just because it's a sort of low-level version of what's happened at the Red Bull. The car's not very good. They don't really understand how to make it better or fix it. But Russell, with his greater experience, having proved himself, got the self-confidence, he can just make it work. And then in the small areas where you can bias it towards your preferences, he gets that say. Whereas Antonelli hasn't got the experience, maybe has some of the raw speed, but not yet the rounded knowledge to kind of move it in his own direction. And then you see how it falls out after that.
I think the interesting thing is, though, I feel that people conflate two things with the Red Bull situation. Verstappen's exceptionally good, and when the car is as Verstappen wants it, very responsive, that kind of lively rear end, pointy car, but he can control it. That is very difficult for many drivers to deal with. You know, the question of rear end instability and what's usable rotation, what's just too lively. That's a variable limit. There's no absolute. But Verstappen's also very, very good at dealing with car limitations. He doesn't like where the Red Bull is generally. He didn't like it at Zandvoort, but he was still kind of single lap pace underlying was probably about 0.3 quicker than Tsunoda, although Tsunoda underachieved in Q2. So there's two things going on there. But ultimately, a driver like Hadjar has to want that opportunity. And actually 26, to play devil's advocate, might not be the worst time to do it, because it'll be a completely different car. More benign aero in terms of the balance. This generation of cars has been very difficult. So there is actually a version of this, because we know Hadjar's good. He's been really impressive this year, where he jumps into a car that, in comparison to the recent run of Red Bulls, has a wider window. It's easier to set up differently and still get the pace out of it, or similar level of pace. And people might be saying, wow, he's a 10th off Verstappen. This is incredible.
Yeah, I do think the reg change means you don't have to go in with quite the same amount of dread. Yes, it's going to be difficult going up against Max Verstappen, you know, arguably, well, almost certainly the best driver on the grid as your teammate. But the reason the Red Bull is where it is now, as Max would tell us, is a legacy of things Red Bull didn't detect or didn't fix quite a long time ago when things were going really well. So they are a long way down. It's not even a path, it's a tunnel where they can't turn around and engineer their way out of it. So those problems shouldn't exist yet with the 26 car. So from that point of view, it's potentially a good time to go there. Obviously, it may be a bad time to go there if the Red Bull powertrain's first proper engine isn't up to scratch. And you know, if Red Bull have a terrible season, a season bad enough that Verstappen then leaves, Hadjar could be suddenly he's the incumbent. He's going, great, I'm lead driver at Red Bull, but we're miles off the pace and it's all down to our engine. So you'd be worried, or you'd have those worries in the back of your mind, but for different reasons.
Yeah, the interesting thing I think for Hadjar now is that in an ideal world, he would get that extra time, but he's reliant on Tsunoda kind of making good on those little promising signs and staying in. Red Bull, once again, with Tsunoda, finds itself in a position where they want Tsunoda to succeed. I think this narrative they don't want the second driver to succeed isn't accurate.
That's nonsense.
I don't think that's fair or correct. And they're sort of willing him on to do it, and then they seem to be setting a timeline horizon of a few months. So it's once we get to kind of the last 3-4 races, they'll make a decision. And yet again, as they were with Albon, as they were with Perez, they're sat on a driver. They're thinking, oh, well, we quite like this guy. We'd like him to be able to stay. Every time they see some progress, they think, oh, it's going to come. And it doesn't. Then at the end of the year, they're having to say, oh, right, we're going to have to do this then. And just history constantly repeats itself. But for Hadjar, he's got to relish an opportunity, hasn't he? He's got to think, yeah, I can absolutely do this. It's a great situation for him because there's reasons why 26 could work for him, but it's not like if he doesn't go in, he's getting passed over necessarily, because I'll think, well, you need a little bit more time building experience. So what a wonderful position to be in. He's proved himself. Nobody's questioning his place on the grid. Red Bull put him in almost reluctantly. What a fantastic place he's built himself into.
Yeah, I mean, whatever we say about the Red Bull situation and the confusing driver program they have now and what's going on with the second car and whatnot, he has been really impressive. You know, he's been the rookie that's outshone the ones you expected to be at the top of everyone's list, Antonelli, Behrman, etc. Like, he's had a brilliant season. He has to back himself to go into Red Bull. That's the whole point of being there. You can't say, oh no, I just to do a second season just to kind of bed in a bit more. Like, that's the wrong attitude. He's got to show that if he belongs at the very top of F1, he can live in that group of 5, 6, 7 drivers who are always at the top of their game, that the top teams want in their cars. I think Red Bull's big problem is they got Max, and he is, as you say, the best driver on the grid, generational talent or whatnot, and they've never been able to find a driver of similar calibre to put in alongside him who's willing to do it or is available. They've always gone for a kind of a Perez, who's a very good driver and probably looks better in retrospect now than maybe we gave him credit for when he was up against Max. But he was nevertheless a midfield ceiling driver, I think it's fair to say. He had a chance in the top team. It didn't really work out. He could do a job, but he was never going to be the guy that could challenge Max over a season, or maybe even a Russell or a Hamilton or a Leclerc over a season. That's what you need in that second car to be truly successful. Look at McLaren, the massive amount of points they have this season, 500 plus. They could wrap up the constructors as early as Baku. That's not just because the car's amazing, it's because they've got two drivers who are capable of extracting the potential of the car nearly every weekend and are pushing each other to the nth degree. Max doesn't have that. That's all coming from him, really. And the only question I have with Hadjar, he's gone up against Tsunoda and Lawson in the same team, and they're guys who've gone into the Red Bull and look pretty average. So what is Hadjar's true level? You don't really know until he goes up against somebody like Max. So he has to find that. He has to find that out. Antonelli struggles. You know, he doesn't look like the shining rookie at the moment, but he's up against George Russell, who you would put in that bracket. You wouldn't say he's necessarily as good as Max, but he's in the conversation for the top 4 or 5 drivers on the grid right now. That is a much tougher benchmark to go up against than Hadjar's faced until now.
Well, the classic question, is it? We don't know his level. And I think you wouldn't necessarily find out his level if you put him in a Red Bull. You find out his level by giving Max Verstappen a Racing Bulls. Let's have all 4 of them in the same car for a weekend, and then we can judge them all properly. But there was 2 things I wanted to pick up on from what Ben said. The first thing was, I think you had a question about this in the post-race podcast, didn't you? Of could Hadjar just say no if he got offered the seat? Obviously, you can't.
No.
For various reasons, but even if Red Bull accepted, okay, this second car seems doomed for whatever reason, it would be a huge red flag to them if in private he went, actually, can I have a second year here because I'm quite comfortable? Because they go, why do you want to be comfortable? Why don't you want to, take the risk? If you're going to be, a superstar in the future, you've got to be willing to put yourself out there. But I wanted to flip the thing we said earlier about 26 being a good time to potentially move into that seat. Would there be an argument if we decided Hadjar should have another year at Racing Bulls? Is there an argument that actually Tsunoda deserves to see how he can get on in the 26 Red Bull if it doesn't have all of these kind of foibles and weaknesses that are catching him and everybody else out under this rule set?
That'd be probably a fairly sensible thing to try and do. Maybe you just
and
accept,
then change it after 2 races again.
Well, that's the thing. Maybe you just accept that the problems with the car are so great that any points you get almost are a bonus, and that's that. And if he can be in that sort of 0.3 window, and Tsunoda's had some decent underlying pace in the past few weekends, so that there's some positive signs there. So yeah, I still think, we're talking almost as if the seat's gone for Tsunoda. It's not. He can still hang on to that seat. Incumbency is very, very powerful. But yeah, I think it all comes back to Red Bull's first problem is the car, and it's not that the car is built for Verstappen. They're always going to be, any team will be guided by their better driver. So you see this with very good drivers alongside all-time greats spotted throughout history, because sometimes they can deal with a car that's a bit trickier but ultimately faster. So that's always going to be there. But there are big limitations with the car that you keep hearing about from Max Verstappen. So that's the number 1, 2 and 3 priority for Red Bull, sorting things out technically. Actually, the second driver doesn't really matter, especially if we think next year the Red Bull powertrain's power unit isn't going to be strong enough to win the championship anyway.
It also depends on what they want to do with drivers coming up. They've got Arvid Lindblad pushing from below. Do they want to promote him into Formula One now? Do they want to wait? Because that changes the equation in terms of what they do with the 4. Obviously Max is protected, but it's like, yeah, you can make a solid argument for Tsunoda stays. It's new rules. We need as much consistency as we get. Lots of teams will say, if they've got a stable driver lineup, we want that for 2026 because it's a variable we don't have to worry about when we're trying to troubleshoot all the other problems we're going to have with these new cars and powertrains. But then the second team, okay, Hadjar's your star guy, but does that mean that then Lawson's done? Or do they want the same thing, some consistency? Does Lindblad replace Lawson? Or do they think, well, actually throwing a rookie into 2026 with so much else going on, that's a mistake. So does he need to be a reserve driver and sit on the fringes for a year? Is that acceptable? That's probably the best outcome for Tsunoda. And bearing in mind, the Honda patronage and everything else, and the fact that they're joining up with another team next year, that's got to play into the equation too. He's not making a cast iron case that he has to stay. They're going to want him to keep closing that gap to Max. You're right to say the second car doesn't matter necessarily in terms of, well, Red Bull have got their stunning lead driver who can give them the technical direction. And I know people will say, okay, so that just means you get a car 100% biased towards Max, but he's also troubleshooting. It's his feedback that led Red Bull to discover one of the things they did wrong last year in terms of the rotation of the car mid-corner. I think it was at Monza he spotted stuff on the data that the aero wasn't behaving the same way it had previously. So he's not some kind of fly in the ointment in terms of making nothing work at Red Bull. It's down to the second driver, whoever it is, to show enough performance that they can start to be trusted on the feedback, not as much as Max, but in the conversation, rather than, well, we just need to have the second car out there and hope that it does well.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the driver choices, they clearly are eager to get Lindblad in, get the next one in. There's always that anxiousness. I would imagine that, obviously Tsunoda's position is questionable. Lawson's position is difficult because he's never going to go back into Red Bull racing, I wouldn't have thought, unless they absolutely have no one else in the cupboard to throw in there. So that's not ideal. But if you're racing bulls, you're probably thinking, actually, we'd rather keep Lawson, because if you're just purely making a decision as a team, that would make more sense for them. So they need to work out what their priorities are, I think. And generally, we see their priorities are towards pushing talent through. So they will be keen to do that, especially with the fear they lose Verstappen down the line, because they need the next Verstappen. And I guess that's the final question, isn't it? I'll throw it to you, Glenn. Is Hadjar a Verstappen replacement if Verstappen heads off into the sunset in 2027 and races for Mercedes, or decides he wants to go and race endurance?
Even though we've just spent the last however many minutes talking him up, I feel like the answer to that question is probably not, in that if you're Red Bull and you lose Max in the next couple of years, I think you've got to go out into the market and look for an established existing superstar, even if that's to tide you over until one of your next cabs off the rank, as you always say, Ed, does become your next star. I feel like, partly because of the reason Ben outlined earlier, there's so much more competition in the young driver scouting ranks now that Red Bull don't have their pick all the time. So they can't always guarantee that, oh, we've lost this guy, but it's okay, we've got a next superstar in waiting already. So unless Red Bull Powertrains is so bad that they are a midfield team and feel they're going to be a midfield team for a few years after 2026, then you maybe you don't have to go and you can't immediately go to a George Russell or a Charles Leclerc or something like that and say, come and lead this project, and in 5 years' time it might be quite good. Whereas if they're up there and suddenly for whatever reason Verstappen goes, nope, I want to go over here, I think they've got to go into the market, get their checkbook out, or a digital equivalent now, and make a superstar signing.
Yeah, that's logical. I think Hadjar's very impressive and he's very, very good. I wouldn't go as far as saying he's a future world champion at this stage. I wouldn't say he's definitely not one, and that's still quite high praise. There have been 34 world champions. They're rare, and not just in terms of opportunity, but in terms of that quality to week after week be at the top of their game. So saying somebody doesn't appear to be a future world champion, but they may still yet get into that class is still promising. But yeah, that's where I'd put him at the moment myself. Let's finish off with a quick blast of questions from the Race Members Club. This comes from the batch that we got after the Dutch Grand Prix. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. And if you are interested in the Race Members Club, there's loads of bonus content there, bonus podcasts, videos. There's a thriving community, loads of great people in there. And of course, you get question asking privileges. So definitely check that out. Check the link in the episode description or head to Patreon. Search for The Race if you're interested. Right, Glenn, first question for you from Sarah. What on earth do Merck do with Antonelli now? Do you think he can turn this around? And did we just inch closer to a Russell Verstappen lineup for 2027? I feel bad for Antonelli. He's so young and still learning, but that lineup would be box office. We had loads of questions about that from Matt Grokut, Anton, James Godfrey Moon, Matthew McCall and Alex Hindley. Alex Hindley mentioned Jacques Villeneuve's critiques on Sky, Glenn. I'll just mention that there. So I've kind of mashed up a big Antonelli question there.
On the bit about is he vulnerable for next year, I can't imagine he is. I think if Mercedes committed to, we're going to bring this guy through, obviously too early, but once you've made that decision, you can't, unless you're Red Bull, you can't then go, we've rushed you in, it was sink or swim, you're sinking, see you later. So I'm sure they're going to give him more time. And I remember I found the Russell Verstappen point in all of those questions really interesting. Firstly, I think wasn't there a recent question where you chose that as your lineup if you could pick any two drivers for the Edd Straw F1 team?
It may well have been, yeah. Sounds like the kind
You've
of thing
already
might have
forgotten.
happened.
Yeah, I'm sure we put it out as a social media clip. But when we talked a few months ago, when we thought, when it looked like Mercedes were still sniffing around Verstappen and Russell was out of contract and looking vulnerable, I was here saying, if you can get Max Verstappen, you sacrifice George Russell for that. It's not a reflection of Russell not being good enough, or whatever. It's just a reflection of what we said earlier. Max is the best driver on the grid. If there's any way to get him, you do it. But I think if we got to the middle of next year and there was a chance to get Verstappen, and Antonelli hasn't taken a big step by then, and Russell's still doing a really good job, it's a much harder decision to make, or maybe it's a much easier decision to make, that you have to keep Russell. So Antonelli's not under immediate pressure. He's definitely got to show some sort of progression, though. I think you really have to hunt for the small peaks and the small things that can give you faith at the moment, and that's not good enough. You can start from a low base. He's definitely come in too soon. We can all accept that, but there comes a point where you have to start showing that there's light at the end of the tunnel. And if we get to the end of this year and he hasn't taken a step, then he's under huge pressure to do that early next year under a new rule set, which might help him because it resets the pack. And you talked earlier, Ben, the fact that Russell knows the quirks of these Mercedes, and I would say that Mercedes definitely haven't worked out these regulations yet, but Russell's been there throughout. So he's driven all of these different Mercedes that have all had slightly different things wrong with them. So maybe he is driving around the problems. We'll find that out early next year. But if Russell's still blowing him away as next year progresses, then I think the pressure really will ramp up.
Zandvoort was at least relatively positive. If he hadn't launched that really stupid move on Leclerc, it would have been a pretty good weekend.
That was a computer game move, wasn't it?
It was terrible, yeah. Just yeah.
But that piles the pressure on, doesn't it? Because you've got Toto Wolff post-race back into defensive mode, having to justify the decision to put the 18-year-old straight into the works team, talking about the long-term potential. He'll learn. He won't make these mistakes in the future. He's in forgiveness mode right now because, as he puts it, they're fighting for P2 or P3 in the championship. We're not fighting for the championship. But next year, if there isn't that progression that you say, he's going to be under massive pressure, Antonelli, to either step up, or Wolff is going to have to answer for this sort of one-upmanship he's pulled on Red Bull. I'm going to do the thing that they didn't do and put the kid straight into the main team. Red Bull, as I said, they put Max through at least one, what would be now a full season in the junior team. Merck haven't done that, but it looks like a mistake. I know I said that drivers, to prove they belong at the highest echelons, have to take on the big dogs, but you don't have to do it straight away. You have to learn kind of how to fight first, and maybe one season is enough if you're exceptional. But Antonelli's been thrust straight in, and I think he does look a little bit out of his depth. Not at all times. There's obviously some serious ability there, but George Russell, even if Mercedes will accept now they waited too long, and maybe that's been in the back of their mind in terms of what they've done with Antonelli, he still learned a lot from that formative period at Williams. It's kind of doing your mistakes out of the spotlight sometimes, just the pressure being less so you can feel free to drive more the natural way. Antonelli's already tightened up because of that FP1 crash he had at Monza last year. And just learning how to communicate with the team, how to conduct yourself. There's lots of intangible stuff that you do behind the scenes that just kind of give you that grounding and that self-confidence, then go into a bigger team against a better driver and do a good job. And I just think Antonelli hasn't had that opportunity, as well as the car just being bad.
We were talking about Hadjar earlier. Yeah, we wouldn't be having that massive, brilliant, positive conversation about the impact Hadjar was making in his rookie season if he'd got into a troubled Red Bull and was having an absolute disastrous time as a rookie. I do feel that trying to find a way to have got Antonelli into a Williams or something like that first, like they did with Russell, would have been the way to go. Because if we get to the middle of 26, they're not going to want to cut him adrift if they decide he shouldn't be in the big team for 27.
Didn't Briatore have a conversation with Toto about Alpine?
Yeah, because they'll be Mercedes powered.
So it's already in the back of their minds that I feel, that even though they publicly say, oh yeah, Antonelli's great and he's one for the future, they feel like they've given him too much too soon.
I'm not sure he deserves the punishment of going to Alpine just yet.
I was going to say on that would be a very bad move to put him into that team, because the way I see it, they're backing him, unless they've just decided, I know we were completely wrong about him, he's an idiot, he's incompetent, which they clearly are not thinking, and he's not been that. They've got to let him cash in that experience next year. He's had the full year, so continuity, same team, going back to the same tracks for another F1 weekend. So it's just a huge amount of data he's building up. So I think to have shunted him into Alpine with the way that team is would have been, I think that would have been pretty irresponsible. I think that would be tantamount to giving up on him. And I'm not sure Toto Wolff would have done it unless he felt he absolutely had to. So although it's a conversation you have, I think you might look at it and think, probably
we've lost.
So let's give him the benefit of the doubt on that. But that's why they've got to stick with Antonelli for next year, and Antonelli will need to take that step for next season.
I am worried if they get to the middle of next year and decide that they need to make a change. It's another reason why you start lower first, because it's better to have kept George Russell at Williams for too long than to have chucked George Russell in before he was ready, then have to demote him. And again, it's what is the demotion? Is it go and be reserve driver for a year, or is it we'll try and find you a seat somewhere else on the grid? Either of those, from the point of you were in the big team and we decided you're not up to it, that's much harder to recover from than any. It wouldn't have been a vote of no confidence to start off in a lower team. No. It's just, this is really hard. F1's really condensed now. Go and do some of your learning slightly out of the spotlight. Make some of those mistakes, like Verstappen did at Toro Rosso. I think that was, you mentioned the Villeneuve comments earlier. One of the things he said, wasn't he? He said, yes, Max made mistakes, but also there was no questions over his speed. And I do take the point that, again, I think, as you mentioned with Toto, you have to fish for the positives at the moment on Antonelli. There's not an obvious, okay, he's really quick, but he's got rough edges. There are some weekends where it all goes completely missing.
Well, he's been set up to fail, I think, because of the fact that Mercedes are what they are now, because George Russell's such a difficult benchmark for a complete rookie, but also because of Toto's obsession, if you like, with Verstappen. He's called Antonelli the new Verstappen, and that's already an impossible act to follow. And then even at Zandvoort, he's saying, he's mentioning Max again. The great ones make mistakes. Max made big mistakes. And you think, well, actually, he didn't really make that many. And also, as a rookie, he looked like he belonged. But also, Toto caveated it and said, well, the environment is not comparable. And that's the big difference. Verstappen went up against a fellow rookie in Sainz. He had a year to learn in a good team, but not with the same pressure and the same impossible benchmark to chase, which would maybe forced him to make more errors and work too hard. Antonelli's forever being compared to Verstappen because of what Wolff has said, but also just doesn't have a situation where he can kind of build up. He's having to really go for it to chase one of the best drivers on the grid, and that's just a recipe for disaster, I think.
The thing that they can't do that they could have done 20, 25 years ago is put him into the test team for a year. And you can't do that with TPC running now.
Felipe Massa.
That was the exact example I was going to use. He had the first season with Sauber, reasonable season actually, up and down certainly. Yeah. But Massa's season with Sauber was certainly no worse than Antonelli's. I'd argue slightly more impressive probably.
Yeah.
And then he had a year testing with Ferrari, because obviously he was a Ferrari contracted driver. They saw him as a future as good a rear Ferrari driver as indeed he was. But if you're doing that, you're testing lots. It's a test team. You're an active part. You're doing tyre testing. You've got your year of racing data, and then you can refine those skills with all that donkey work.
Alonso did the same, didn't he?
Tens of thousands of kilometres. And if it was 20, 25 years ago, I'd say there'd be an argument for doing that, but there isn't now. They've got to stick with him, let him cash in that experience, and I think Wolff will back him to the hilt, and I think that can pay off because there is a driver there.
Just one small thing I wanted to add is that I've seen there's been a few indications of, everybody's expectations are too high, people are expecting too much of him. That's because Mercedes spent all that time telling us how great he was and that he may be the next Verstappen. The expectation wouldn't have been there had he not been talked up so much by the people who are now complaining about the level of expectation being put upon him.
Very much so, and ultimately anybody being thrown straight into a top team there is enormous level of expectation. Just quickly, Ben, a connected question for you from Robert Chambers. Antonelli may not have had his qualifying pace yet, but he has shown a knack for overtaking all year, even if he got over-aggressive at Zandvoort. Do you think his race pace and developing overtaking skills is more important at this stage than his qualifying ability, which is harder to learn?
Well, I don't think overtaking is really something you learn. Like racecraft is much more instinctive, and I think probably some of the recent examples of Antonelli racing well, setting Zandvoort to one side, are places like Spa where he's underperformed in qualifying, and so he's in a car that should by rights be making progress. And yeah, he did some good moves, but it's kind of, bread and butter. I think the thing you're looking for from your rookie driver is the raw pace has to be there, and you it's almost a given. Like if you're not quick enough, you're not going to last, and that all depends on how you relate to your teammate. But then it's about how consistently can you access your potential, how consistently can you deliver in the pressured moments, but also how well and can you adapt and learn the technical attributes of F1 in terms of optimizing the car, using the tools at your disposal, showing that you can feed back in a way that improves the car. Because I feel like the gap between the specialist nature of F1 and how deep the level of engineering is and how much there is to change, how many parameters you can adjust, is so far removed from what's available in the junior categories. I know the junior teams are trying to catch up in terms of having high-level simulators and whatnot, but it's a world away. And so that's the thing that Antonelli has to learn. It's the thing that we can't really see from the outside, is like how well is he integrating into the kind of technical briefings and working with the team. That's the bit he learns. The other two bits, the racecraft and the speed, they have to be kind of, they're almost, taken as given on entry, aren't they?
Yeah, I think that underlying speed, you want to see those peaks of pace. We haven't seen enough of that from Antonelli this year. Right, a question now from Gavin Cameron that I'll take. Is Oscar Piastri disliked in the paddock, or is he just not as popular as Norris? No matter what happens with Piastri, it seems that F1 TV and Sky, along with McLaren, constantly bring the conversation back to Norris, or is it just that they're inextricably linked? Well, I see this quite different. I mean, Piastri's not disliked in the paddock. He's well respected. He's liked, I would say. But this is one of those things that's dictated by what happens, because Norris has been more the story, because Piastri generally has been very, very good, and he hasn't had these moments where he's sort of not quite delivering at the level he should be.
He's almost metronomic, isn't
exactly. So the Piastri story hasn't changed, whereas Norris has been this roller coaster ride. And obviously at Zandvoort, the storyline was the guy who blew up. It was Norris. So I think this is just driven by what the prevailing narrative is, and there's not so much you can say about Piastri without constantly repeating yourself. Whereas with Norris, there's been all of this up and down. He's been very open about his weaknesses and struggles at times as well, which also feeds into that. Whereas Piastri just kind of becomes this constant line. So I don't think these things don't reflect how much people like people or sympathy or that kind of thing. It reflects what the storylines are.
Yeah, it's narratively driven, you're right. There's also probably a small element of like charisma and personality differences. Like Piastri is just very even-tempered and flat, very uncontroversial, and also hasn't had much to discuss because he's been so metronomic, as Glenn put it, whereas Norris has been up and down, but also is very blunt and quite honest when he faces the media in terms of what his struggles are, perhaps too honest. And so that creates more of the narrative. It feeds this appetite to hear what he's got to think and how is he going to fix it and what's he going to do next. So I think there's a kind of just a natural biasing there just because of how they conduct themselves.
Oh, don't say bias. Just on the Sky point, this obviously comes up a lot because their coverage is seen in a lot of places, but we do have to remember they are nominally the UK F1 broadcaster. So if there is a British guy versus someone else in a championship fight, there will be elements of their production where they feel they're talking to primarily a British audience who may be slightly more interested in the British driver as well.
Biased, you might say.
Well, this is it. There's a difference between bias and it would be like, what's the, how much does the Italian broadcast talk about Ferrari? Yeah. And, how much does we have Nelson on from the Dutch broadcast? I'm sure they spend a lot of their time talking about Max Verstappen. It's partly the nature of the game. You just never used to see it because the international broadcast didn't travel in the way that they can now.
I think it's also worth mentioning, because there's a question about McLaren constantly bringing the conversation back to Norris, but there's a lot of questions. So a lot of the time Andrea Stella will be answering questions. Stella will also always be at pains to, if there's a question about one driver, he'll quite often throw in the other driver, because that's how he sees things. And also, I would say, Andrea Stella was talking a lot about what PiastrI did at Zandvoort the weekend in terms of the turnaround from struggling a bit on Friday to being able to take pole position and win. So McLaren talk about them both. So a lot
they're
of the time,
preoccupied with it, though, aren't they? In terms of how they treat both. They've even discussed how they deal with when one of them inevitably loses the World Championship. How much do we celebrate with the other guy? So there's definitely a sense that McLaren are self-aware.
They are conscious of that. So and I think they generally that is sincere as well. Certainly with someone like Andrea Stella, who just wants the team to do well. So I think that I can only really speak for myself and some of my colleagues here, but I think people genuinely overestimate how much people involved in covering it care who wins.
Yeah.
I genuinely don't.
100%.
I don't care who wins in terms of. So I like to see drivers fulfilling their potential. So quite often, there's all sorts of drivers. If they win, you'll sort of be sort of vaguely happy for them. But I don't really care. What I care is about how and why, and understanding that. And there's no that I would say among the journalists. There's you do get the odd one, but there's very few flag waving journalists who really are that bothered. So you always have to be careful.
Is there less cheering in the media centre than there used to be? Because 10 years ago you would get those partisan sections, but also you would just get the general enthusiasm. So an incident would happen or an accident, and you just get whoa.
You more get oohs, and that kind of thing. Not from me. I'm fairly silent.
No, seen it all, haven't you?
I'll sometimes laugh. A bit Schadenfreude.
I've also, to go back to the original question, I've not heard anyone say, I've never heard any inkling of dislike from anyone who works in F1 towards Piastri.
No, Piastri's very, very well liked. There's good feelings towards him. They like the progression he's made. Whoever wins the World Championship, people will be happy for them. Just because someone winning the World Championship is the pinnacle. I mean, I've never, when someone's won the World Championship, been annoyed or miserable about it. It's like, right, someone's won good for them. Yeah, because that's the thing. So, we'll hope to balance that one. But definitely, no dislike for Piastri at all. And I think just always, if you take one thing away from this little segment of the conversation, it's just think about what the storylines are and what drives the questions that people ask, because it's what's the storyline. And if Piastri suddenly starts saying, oh no, I was just struggling with this, that, and starts having the performance profile of a Norris, then suddenly the conversation changes. Right, Glenn, a question from Stuart Coulter. On Thursday at Zandvoort, John Noble and Scott Mitchell-Malm talked about Mercedes not being in any particular rush to re-sign George Russell, particularly as George is managed by Mercedes. This got me thinking, should teams and team principals be allowed to manage drivers when they may not always act in their drivers' ultimate interests, compared to, say, a traditional manager like Julian Jacobi?
It's a good question. Firstly, I would say Russell has agreed to be managed by Toto Wolff or whoever's involved at Mercedes, because at some point it was probably in his interest to do that. So, he hasn't done that against his will. So if there ends up being a downside to it, it's like, well, you took the good side of it when it benefited you. Maybe it'll work against you here. I can see the argument that, how is that not a conflict of interest? And it's been around for ages. Eddie Jordan managed drivers even before he had an F1 team and was helping guys into F1, and was then trying to get a cut of deals when he sold on drivers that he had under contract and all that sort of thing.
Managed Adrian Newey, didn't he?
Well, yeah, as we found out, yeah. It played a crucial role.
Paid better than most drivers.
In the move to Aston Martin. Flavio Briatore has done this for years, and we often find out when we do bring back V10's research, there were drivers who either didn't join Benetton/Renault because they wouldn't agree to give Flavio a massive cut of their salary when he was their team boss. Again, how is that not a conflict of interest? But yeah, Briatore's always had some sort of control over certain drivers. But what I would also say, using the Flavio example, he was kind of dictating Fernando Alonso's career, but when Alonso wanted to sneak his way out of Renault, he found a way to do it without Flavio being aware. So maybe Russell should go and ask Alonso how he did that. If George ever wants to get out of Mercedes, he can ask Fernando for some tips.
And also, even if you did want to regulate it out, let's say, it's impossible to do, because there can be very complex management structures.
Well, Briatore kept doing it when he was completely banned and wasn't supposed to be doing it like that, was he? I think it's fair to say that now.
Yeah, exactly. Obviously, he got that ban overturned. So, but it happens a lot. And there's all sorts of connections like that often aren't even talked about or necessarily known about, or you find out about them after they've been going on for a few years, etc. So it's just, I think it's the way of the world. It's quite difficult to stop. It's a bit uncomfortable in a way, but it's just life, I guess. Right, Ben, a question for you from Rachel Fleming. With both Cadillac seats filled now, is it becoming more likely that Franco Colapinto will remain for 2026 alongside Pierre Gasly at Alpine?
Oh, I think he will. That's my instinct. They might wait to see which of the Red Bull drivers is left over, just because you might, Briatore's been talking about needing a more experienced reference in the car, and they flirted with this idea of signing Valtteri Bottas, and he's now saying, well, we were just used as a handy bargaining chip for Bottas to get his Cadillac contract over the line. But if they're doing their diligence, which you can't be sure of because of that team being so chaotic, you've got to see who's available, and I feel like there's going to be an ex-Red Bull driver available, and a Tsunoda-Gasly partnership would work quite well. They worked quite well before at AlphaTauri. So I think you'd look at that and then go, well, do we want that or not? What's the commercial reality behind that? I feel like Colapinto is starting to crack on a bit and settle down. I think he was quite unlucky not to get points in Zandvoort. He was kind of there with Gasly, which is what you want, rather than way off, which was the case in the early races he did. But also he's got that South American backing behind him. And I think as long as that's there and the checks are being cashed, or whatever the digital equivalent is nowadays, that strengthens his position within that team, because it's clear that they're trying to save money. You wouldn't ditch your whole engine program if you weren't, and go to a cheaper customer option. So I think as long as he's not tanking in performance terms over the rest of the season, that improvement plus the cash behind him will secure his seat for next year, probably.
And the final question that I'll take from Hugo Pring: would Verstappen in a Racing Bulls car be quicker and win more races than in a Red Bull? Similar question from Mitchell Woolno. Yeah, a lot of people have talked about that. I don't think generally he would be. I mean, Verstappen being in it would fundamentally change the car as well, because he'd be able to lead it into areas where it's a bit...
Make it worse.
Tricky. Well, no, where it's a bit tricky to drive. It's just what happens, because he has an unusual set of skills in terms of how of the kind of car dynamics, the quick car dynamics he can handle. But I think there'll be occasions, Zandvoort maybe he would have been a bit quicker than in the Red Bull, but I think globally over the season he'd have more success in the Red Bull, because it is still a quick car. The Racing Bulls, you can't just say, oh, Tsunoda's this much slower than Verstappen, look how quick the Racing Bulls were. You can't add that on, because it's completely different.
He's not going to win on merit, is he? That's the thing. The Red Bull's very good on a certain circuit, and he's been able to win against the odds. Yeah. In a Racing Bulls, he probably gets a better average result across the season in some places, but he's not going to win a race in that car without circumstances.
And he'd probably have better Fridays. You see Red Bull, they put the car on the track on a Friday and it's horrendous, and then they have to spend Friday night fixing it. So at least he'd get in a Racing Bulls and go, oh, this is quite good, let's see what he can do. So I agree, it would maybe be more consistent and not as many headaches, but that absolute peak that he can still sometimes access perhaps wouldn't be there. But I'd love to see it. We've got to find a way. Let's just park, as I said earlier, I said let's park the second Red Bull. Let's park both Red Bulls for a weekend. Give those drivers Racing Bulls and just see what happens.
Yeah, I think that might cause a bit of controversy among some of the other teams, but it would be fun and interesting, wouldn't it? Well, thanks very much, Glenn and Ben. Thanks to everybody who sent in questions. We are now going to pack our bags and head to Monza, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the Italian Grand Prix.